This is my 2003 Nissan 350Z. A far cry from what I would consider to be ultra clean, but I'm certain it's fared better than most of the rare examples I find out here in the wild. Despite its reasonable condition, we have a few issues that we're going to need to address. The factory brakes have met their end, and I have something waiting in the wings as a very worthy upgrade. So we are going to exchange these small, rusty, floating calipers for something a little bit better. This 4 and 2 piston Akebono big brake kit can be found on both Sport and Nismo 370 and Newsies, as well as some high-end Sport Infinity models. So let's take a closer look behind these wheels and see what we're really dealing with. The fronts, truthfully, aren't so bad. As for the rear, I can't quite say the same. Let's get the car in the air so I can show you what's going on beyond the rust and terrible rotor condition. With the front wheels chocked, I'm going to lift the vehicle by the rear differential. I have rubber pads for my jack stands to give the aging pinch welds a fighting chance. With those correctly in place, we're going to drop it down slowly and head to the front. I like to really take my time with the lowering process. And now corner by corner for the front, but same idea. I'm going to raise it the minimum amount for now. I can always raise it more as needed later. And just like that, all 4 corners are raised in the air and we can get started. I really recommend you take your time getting the lifting process secured like this. That way you can go ahead confidently in your work. Now with the wheels free, I'm going to disengage the handbrake and show you what's going on. Not moving so good, are we? That's nothing compared to this side. Almost completely motionless. I had found this at work when I threw on the lift. I noticed one of my wheels was hot. This one barely rotates. And note that this is not from lack of driving or lot rot, as they say, but this is after continuous driving and rechecking and properly lubricated slide pins. We're gonna go ahead and capitalize on this opportunity for a serious improvement. Now I have a whole slew of accompanying parts to go along with the brake kit, and I'll give you a full rundown of those once I get this apart. With the wheels out of the way, I just need to remove these slightly seized in place hub centering rings. A helpful trick that I found is to utilize a razor blade in tandem with a flathead screwdriver to create an ultra thin pry bar. Just walk it around evenly and it'll come loose without damage. We're going to wire wheel everything clean and ready for new parts once we get the caliper and rotor off. I'm going to try to keep everything nice and organized. We are going to have a lot of part very soon. So I did go around and do one final pass with some PP Blaster to get things freed and ready to be removed. Honestly, I've dealt with worse, and I think this shouldn't really be much of a problem. Hardest part likely being just the brake lines. 2 quick 19mm bolts, and we'll get this caliper off. I never totally loved using a brake bar in this configuration, so I'll show you another way. We can basically create a go anywhere impact simply with a combo wrench, a rag, and a hammer. It's the same technique I used to use with just my palms, doing a quick 2-minute alignment on the fly. And with those 4 cracked free, I'm just gonna walk these out by hand with my trusty stubby ratchet. Fortunately for me, the actual hardware of the calipers has been absolutely no problem. A little slowdown here and there, but the threads are clean. That's the most important thing. Now with the mounting bolts out, we're just gonna pry the caliper away from the rotor and walk it off the rest of the way. It's fighting me back and forth just a little bit, and now that lip on the edge of the rotor is very apparent. Oof. It's all about those small victories. That rotor came off with almost zero effort. Now just to crack the brake line, which has been soaking profusely in PB Blaster. I technically should have braced the bottom before doing that. And with the retainer removed, we're going to back out the thread of the hardline the rest of the way. With questionable areas that still have importance, such as this, I like to add a little bit of penetrating fluid as we go, or at least some kind of lubricant just to help it walk itself out without damage. Alright, that soft line attachment point clung on for dear life just a little bit, but now we can stow this entire caliper assembly away from the car. Alright, same goes for the other side. Although we didn't lose much, I did try to catch as much of that brake fluid as possible in some drain pans. Unfortunately, I had made a pretty severe rust discovery, we'll call it, but I decided to not let this derail the whole project. Things are already set in motion. I'm going to see this through. Once the job is done, I'm going to see about repairing and replacing the damaged metal. Alright, with the disappointment set aside, let's get the brackets for the brake lines off. Just 2 quick 12mm bolts. These are coming out real smoothly. With all 4 of these off, including the front, we can get them brushed and wire wheeled clean, at least free of corrosion so we can throw a fresh coat of paint on them. I like to take any opportunity I can to prevent further rust spread. Now for the rear of this big brake kit to work, we do need to make one slight modification to specifically the rear brakes. This lip on the rear dust shield is going to interfere because we have that larger rotor size. In addition to that, the leading edge on this corner right here is going to interfere slightly with that larger caliper. So I went ahead and took care of the cutting on the opposite side first. I started off by making the first crude cut with the 16th cutting wheel. Then I followed the cuts with my die grinder to make them nice and uniform. This can create an almost factory appearance if you're patient. Lastly, I did a final pass with a wire wheel to deburr and also to make sure it's free of sharp edges that could catch anything. Let me quickly show you the comparison to the new upgraded rotor. The size compared to the factory one is pretty substantial. With that in mind, I'm going to grab myself one of the new rotors to test fit for clearance with that dust shield, both with that as well as a new caliper. It may first appear to be a little silly to mount a caliper this way with no rotor in place, but this is going to allow us to see that side clearance and make sure everything is fitting properly. I'm trying to avoid that leading edge of the mounting point of the caliper from just rubbing against that dust shield, of course. Before we move on quickly, I'm going to remove the front brake brackets since we already took off the rear for paint as well. Simply have to take off this one nut for the brake line and the 2 in the front area to simply take it off of that knuckle section. Nice and easy. I honestly can't complain too much so far with how the hardware is coming apart. Now let's do the same on the opposite side. I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised because I did go around pretty religiously with the PB Blaster. When you use penetrating fluid like that, especially multiple instances, you really should not run into much of a problem. Alright, cool. So with these removed, we can join them in with the rears, and you can see the comparison with the fresh coat of paint. A little goes a long way. Alright, let's get back to cutting. This time, I will share the process with you. Bear in mind as I do this that I both have on safety glasses as well as a face shield to protect me, as well as honestly my camera. Not that I like to pretend by any stretch of the imagination that I am a pro fabricator of metal, but please exercise some patience and some caution in doing this sort of thing. Try to keep on the shield on your cutting wheel. I know a lot of people remove them. It can add a little bit of tedious time. adjusting it into the right position, but I do honestly personally feel that it's worth the extra effort. Next, we're just gonna lop off those triangular sections for the caliper. Now to smooth those edges. Now we can hit the entirety of the dust shield with the wire wheel to strip everything for paint. Swapping to a larger wire wheel, that way we can cover more surface area and also get in that crevice at the base. Now that we have everything pretty much stripped away, I went ahead and did a couple quick things just to help with adhesion of the paint. I hit it with some steel wool, and then I used a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to really make sure that surface was clean and dry so the paint actually sticks. Some oil-based enamel and chip brushes later, and we have a fresh new look. Now on old cars especially, I don't believe in disassembly without cleanup, so I went ahead and deep cleaned the wheel well, as well as behind the cover where the fuel filler neck is. So now I'll pop that back on with some fresh new clips to make sure it's nice and secure. Perfect. Now we're going to reinstall the bracket for the brake line, the ones that we just refinished. So I have some brand new OE hardware that we're going to cover with just a little bit of anti-seize before we send them home. So as you set this back in place, you'll see how the opening lines up with that hard line.
Right there.
This is a pretty low torque situation, so bear in mind that you have a little bit of flexibility with how the bracket slides and positions itself against those two bolts. So just make sure it lines up the way that you think it should.
You got a little bit of wiggle room here, so.
Alright, all aligned and secured. I'm also going to throw a fresh nut on the mounting bracket point for the filler neck. I have a slew of fresh OE hardware that I'm trying to just use wherever possible. Some anti-seize once again, and we're all set. So guys, let me know your thoughts on the POV style segments. Personally, I've been enjoying it a lot because it allows me to remain far more efficient. Most of you guys will know I prefer a more cinematic, meticulous approach with a lot of detail, so you guys don't miss a thing. But lately I've been balancing a lot between work, my family, and excess time, of course, goes to the Eclipse project behind me, as well as other things outside of the automotive space. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, and let's get back to it. As previously stated, here is the Akebono big brake kit, in addition to some parts to complete the package. I've opted to reuse the original mounting pins, clips, and cotter pins. I've just given them a thorough cleaning so they're ready to install. These used calipers honestly cleaned up quite well. I also applied a coating to hopefully keep them to stay that way for at least a little while. In addition to the obvious, we also have some Motul brake fluid, some EBC slotted brake rotors, cleaned up OE mounting hardware, some new OEM brake line clips, banjo bolts and crush washers, as well as some StopTech stainless steel brake lines. Aside from a few other random odds and ends to clean things up, we also have a Brake Master cylinder brace we're going to install to help with the brake feel just a little bit further. Diving back in here, I'm going to be applying a very thin coating of my favorite silicone ceramic grease, distributing it very evenly against this hub here, hopefully helping to mitigate some corrosion amongst the wheel, hub, and brake rotor. Obviously being very careful to not apply any to the brake surface or lug studs. With the new rotor mounted up, we're going to do a quick 360 view to check for clearance with our freshly reshapened dust shield. Everything is looking clear and moving freely as it should, so we're going to move forward with the install. With the rotor set in position with a single lug nut, I'm going to pop in the dust cover for the e-brake adjustment. Now with the mounting bolts for the caliper, we're going to apply some blue light duty thread locker, applying a small, keyword small, amount on these just so they can't vibrate themselves free. Kind of the same logic with the anti-seize. A little goes a long way, plus you kind of don't want to disperse it everywhere. Bringing in the caliper nice and easy, trying not to rub it against the rotor too much unnecessarily, but looks like we have great clearance just like the other side with that corner area that we cut away on the dust shield. Alright, get those finger tight before we break out the ratchet to snug them down the rest of the way by hand. Now with those nice and reasonably torqued, I'm actually going to apply a little bit of force on the bottom of the lower control arm area, just so that we can take some of that preload into the suspension, so that when we use our torque wrench, we're going to get a nice firm click and we're not articulating the suspension with all that force. Alrighty, with the calipers fixed in position and torqued down, let's take care of the brake lines. First, we're going to grab our new banjo bolts. Do not use the OEM ones. My sources tell me that these new ones are shortened to work with the Akebonos. Placing a copper crush washer on both sides of the banjo, and we're ready to thread these into the caliper. Now I'm using a 1/4 inch torque wrench for this, but utilize whatever process makes you feel most comfortable in this instance. It goes without saying that this is an area where we avoid guesswork, and we'll be assessing things again later on. Now for the other end that goes into the hardline, we'll start by softly threading it in by hand. Now before we do the final torque down, we want to install the spring clips to lock things in position. These slot into position in the small gap that appears when the hardline comes up through the bracket. Truthfully, the process could be a little bit on the crude side. I like to start it with a sledge and do the final impacts with a rubber mallet. Looking pretty good. Obviously, the lock clip does not need to be perfectly straight, but just do the best you can to get it centralized. Alright, now to get things lubricated up for the brake pad installation. I'll tell you where I'm going to put grease in this instance, but I know this is a debated subject. You do what you feel is best. So far, I've done the 8 flat pad areas on the interior of the caliper, a heavy coating in a circular pattern where the piston is going to be pressing on the back of it, a light coating on the entirety of the ends, as well as a heavy amount on the corner ears. And with that, I'd say I'm ready to drop them in. We just have a few other quick things to lubricate before we wrap this up. For the retaining clip on top, I just do the downward facing flat ends. As for the pins, I like to apply grease pretty liberally, as those do need to slide through the small openings. Just apply minimal pressure on the right areas of the retaining clip and send them right through. This should take very minimal force. Alrighty, same goes for the other pin. However, on this one, you might have to adjust the position of the brake pad just a little bit for alignment purposes. Once you see the pin protruding from that front opening in the caliper, you know it's seated in place. Alright, now home stretch. Now with these Akebonos, there is a slight difference compared to the Evo Brembos on the Eclipse, for example. There are 2 small cotter pins that hold the main pins in position. The back of the Akebono pins is a Phillips head, so we can position the opening that we need, and I'm going to use needle nose pliers to slide those down. The procedure is definitely a little finicky, but it is far easier to put the pins in compared to those Brembos. Those I had to use a sledgehammer and a punch to get to go through all the way. And with that small but important step out of the way, looks like we have these rear brakes all wrapped up. Migrating our way to the front, I'm going to first remove one last nut that's retaining the brake line back here. Alrighty, with that freed up, now we can focus on removing the caliper with these 2 bolts right over here. Alrighty, I have my 22mm socket on my telescopic ratchet, but I did already go ahead and break these loose with a breaker bar. Definitely some tighter hardware that we're dealing with here compared to the rear. Gonna swap out to the stubby ratchet real quickly to walk these out by hand. I never quite liked using power tools in this arrangement, just not my thing, especially at home. Alright, setting those bolts aside, this caliper should slide off the rotor much easier. There we are. Nice and easy. Now let's get this rotor off. Wow, okay. Once again, I was really anticipating needing the sledge for this. We obviously did not need a flathead or a pry tool to get the caliper upward. In that case, normally you would actually have to apply a lot of force to get this off, but when you know you're gonna throw it away, you can obviously give it hell. Once again, with one of our containers ready, we're gonna crack that brake line. Making sure that it's all freed up, we're gonna remove that spring clip. Always a little bit of a battle. There we go. Now let's get this off and draining. Giving it a moment to let the residual come on out. Then we're just gonna position this upward so we can set this aside for now without it dripping out. All right, now let's talk front dust shield. In this case, we just have one small corner cut to make down here, and we'll push the entirety away just a little bit for some added safety clearance. Once again, I've already done the other side, and we're gonna use the cutaway residual piece as a template for this side. That way, more or less, things are mirrored identically from side to side. Just going to mark it edge to edge with a Sharpie. That way we know where to cut. Easy enough. Now we're gonna throw on our safety glasses and our shield just to keep things under control. And we're gonna get ready to make that cut. Now, bear in mind as you make this cut though, we do need to pay a little bit more extra attention compared to before. We wanna watch how deep we plunge through so we don't hit anything on the backside. Like I said, a little bit awkward, especially avoiding that hub surface, but we can make it happen. Just gonna smooth that out a little bit so it's not a total death trap. Now I'm also gonna flatten that corner angle. I don't really like that 90 degree, so we'll hit it with the grinder to make a nice flat edge. All right, now that's looking much better. Now we're just gonna hit this back a little bit. Not only is this going to create a little bit more clearance, it's also going to actually channel air behind the rotor to, I guess, theoretically help with cooling. Or just welcoming more rocks and debris. Who knows? Let's clean up a little bit. All right, now that's a little bit better of a foundation. And just like before, let's get that newly shaped dust shield a fresh coat of paint. It was a little rusty and in the way, so I went ahead and removed the little bracket that locks out the steering angle. Hit it with some paint and with some anti-seize on both the mating surface as well as the two bolts. It'll be easier to deal with later on. Trying my best to install this without spreading anti-seize throughout the universe, but we'll see. Looking pretty good. Now we can attach the mounting bracket for the larger caliper. So here we have the bracket itself, the caliper bolts with lock and flat washers, the bolts for the bracket, and the washers from the original hardware that we're going to reuse. I just got them cleaned up with a wire wheel. And some thread locker that we're going to use for the bolts that mount the bracket, but not the ones that hold the caliper on. With the original washers placed on the bracket bolts, like I said, we're just going to apply a good amount of that blue thread locker. I just focused on the end threads that are engaging the most, the rest will disperse itself. There we can see how the bracket positions itself on the knuckle and the bolts come through from the front side. Considering the critical nature of these, I decided to walk these through as far as I could by hand, before of course grabbing the usual stubby. Obviously a lot of thread engagement here, but that's exactly what you want. Alright, with both of those snug down, time to break out the torque wrench. To torque things down, we're actually going to rotate the entire knuckle assembly by of course steering the car, in this case all the way to the right. Just going to pop it in an accessory, and we'll rotate this all the way to the lock. We're going to torque these down nice and evenly, going back and forth between the two. I'm going to do 3 assurance passes at the very end. 1, 2, 3. All secure. Now we can test fit these 14-inch brake rotors. Fitting up perfectly. Once again, we're going to get this all seated in place with some lug nuts. I'm just going to snug these down real lightly. Perfect. No rubbing, no noises, no clearance issues. Now to get the actual caliper hardware sorted, lock washer followed by a flat washer, and let's get this together. Officially bringing these into position, it really becomes apparent how large these are. At least compared to what we're starting with. Perhaps not, compared to some of the 6-piston brakes you'd find on a Porsche, for example. Once again, we're going to seat these both down by hand. With no thread locker this time, like I said. Let's let the torque and the lock washers do their job in this case. Now I like to do critical hardware such as these in stages, seated down by hand, snugged with one of my smaller ratchets, torqued to a reasonable level with one of my longer ones, and lastly, of course, ready for final torque. Call me crazy, but I don't like to mess around when it comes to brakes or drivetrain components. Doing this honestly just prevents things from being under-torqued, which could be dangerous, or over-torqued, which may or may not be a total pain next time. Or even in a worst case scenario, if things seat down unevenly, you can even crack parts or damage threads. We don't want to deal with any of that. Alright, with this caliper torqued down, we're going to go ahead and throw on this brake line bracket. Same premise as before, and we're also going to throw in a little bit of that anti-seize again. Moving on to the brake pads. Same as before, a light coating across the entire back. These have dual pistons on both sides of the caliper, so we are going to do 2 heavy rings around for each. A light coating across both of the ends, and a heavy amount on the ears. Again, across the entirety of the pins, and the 4 corners on the retaining clip. All good, let's drop them in. These do tend to fall through considerably, so I like to rest it in place and then start the pins to hold that first back pad. That way we not only take control of the situation, but we also keep grease from going anywhere it shouldn't be. Again, just a little bit of pressure on the center of the retainer, and also on the outside, just to carry them all the way through. Wipe off some of that excess grease, and let's lock things down with those cotter pins. These are the same exact cotter pins as the rears, so they are indeed interchangeable as far as I can tell. Same procedure, support the pin from the back on the Phillips head, and drop them in with a small-headed pair of pliers. Looking good. And with the pads all squared away, let's take care of the brake line. Same goes, banjo bolt through with the copper washer on both sides. I went ahead and turned the wheel more straight forward. It helps to have a more neutral position in the steering while we're routing that brake line. Just gonna get that initial threading onto the hard line. And since I didn't show this too clearly before, as you press up, that is the gap that the spring clip is gonna lock down into. And the more important detail is that right beneath that is the hex that we can hold onto to keep everything secure while we torque things down. I won't lie to you, these front spring clips really gave me hell. When they're OE like this and brand new, they're gonna be really thick and hard to get into place. Just be careful, but commit. With the clip in place, we're gonna torque this down with that wrench supporting on the bottom. The brake line connection to the caliper calls for 12 to 14 foot-pounds, so I'm going to set my small torque wrench to 144 inch-pounds and we'll secure things down to where we see fit from there. Supporting the brake line and the banjo bolt end, we're going to of course click it down into place, making sure things feel just right. We'll be doing plenty of thorough safety checks toward the tail end to be sure we have absolutely no hydraulic leaks. And with that, we'll secure the brake line and we're ready to move on to the final stages. A couple quick pieces of advice. Throughout this process, I could have mentioned earlier, you want to keep an eye on your brake fluid level. In my particular instance, I honestly lost very little fluid and the brake fluid reservoir actually stayed quite full. Main point being that you want to prevent air from entering the master cylinder, preventing the bleeding process from becoming unnecessarily difficult. Before we begin the bleeding procedure, I am going to do the final checks. Checking both the bleeders, which is 2 per caliper for 8 total across the vehicle, as well as all hardline connections. Final piece of preparatory advice. I think a good policy to have is to clean the floor area beneath both the hardline connection as well as the caliper area. That way, if we have any leaks while we're actually applying pressure to the pedal, we can notice that issue visually on the floor. Just a quick wipe down, and if there's anything there later, we know. Moving on to the brake master cylinder brace. This part comes in 2 main primary pieces as well as a whole packet of a slew of hardware to put things together. So we have 2 different length optional bolts to thread out and brace against the master cylinder itself, as well as the other hardware to brace it against the chassis on the strut tower, the firewall, and the small bracket going to the reservoir. First, we just need to remove 2 of the 3 nuts holding on the strut top hat. As usual, I already sprayed these with some PB, and I can make quick work of them with this 3/8 ratchet and a short extension. Now, just to remove the 2 10mm bolts holding on the clutch fluid reservoir, this is a little tight and finicky. Now to remove the bracket holding up that same reservoir, just these 2 bolts from the outside. We'll be replacing this with the new one. Now let's position the new outer bracket. This hardline connection is a little bit in the way, but we can release this clip deep in here with a pair of those angled deep pliers. This affords us just a little bit more wiggle room. Now with that raised up slightly, we can go ahead and drop it in place. Still a tight fit. Now just to pop that clip back in place, but this is where I ran into my first actual problem. No matter what I did, the clearance to that hardline is just way too tight for my liking. I'm taking matters into my own hands. We're going to shave that corner, giving it a far more superior shape to avoid that hardline altogether. I do not want that constantly applying pressure to it like that. With a couple passes of the die grinder, we get a nicely swept, tapered piece. Alright, I'm good enough with that to move on. Now we drop in these 2 bolts. These are barrel bolts that go in and are going to brace it onto the strut tower. These bolts have a larger head size, so I actually went down to a 1/4 inch with a much longer extension to reach them. So the way this primarily works is we have this long bolt that can adjust outward and a jam nut to lock it in place on this bracket against that master cylinder. And this is where we ran into our second problem, an actual total roadblock. Now, I'm not going to throw Z1 under the bus over this. Reason being, I was able to get in quick and really clear contact with them. Of the two included bolts, one was too long to fit at all, and the other was too short to reach. I didn't want to waste time, so I went to the hardware store and found the correct length bolt. However, they also immediately shipped me the correct one for this. In addition to that, I was also informed that they had updated the product, so this hopefully won't be an issue for anyone else. Glazing over that slightly awkward predicament, we can now move on to bolting through into the other half of this bracket piece. This is what holds the reservoir as well as the bolt we were just talking about. With that snug down, I can now extend that adjustment bolt all the way out until it makes reasonable contact with the master cylinder. From here, we can adjust it to the proper amount of pressure and lock it down with the jam nut. It goes without saying that you obviously don't want to overdo this. You want just enough pressure to keep the firewall from flexing when you press the pedal under heavy braking. With that locked down, I can now reattach the clutch fluid reservoir now onto the mounting point of the new bracket. Again, a little finicky, but the smaller 1/4 inch tools can work their magic. And it looks like that's a wrap on the master cylinder brace. And now to hide all of our work behind the brake service cover. And now to start the bleeding process. To start, I had my wife pulse the pedal a few times to get the farthest point initialized. Then I did a full pass with my vacuum bleeder just to get things primed up. Like I said, all the while keeping an eye on our brake fluid level and topping up as necessary. You really don't want to have to start all over again because you sucked in some more air. Now for the standard procedure, I like to have the secondary person pump the brakes 3 times, holding on the last, open the valve, let the fluid pass, close the valve, and of course raise the pedal back up. I like to do this cycle 3 times per bleeder, starting with the inner one with the engine running so the brake booster is active. And with that, our pedal is firm, our brake fluid level is topped up to the full line, and we have no visible leaks. Now just to throw on our dust covers for the bleeders. And let's have a look at that striking before and after. First, hub centering rings, and let's get these wheels back on. For the rear, the brake clearance to the spokes is not that tight, so we don't need to be very careful, but I can't say the same about the front. Nice to see it coming together. Now with all the lug nuts started by hand, we can just set the brake and torque them down. For this, I use a brake depressor, plus you can use the e-brake to assist for the rear. A nice tool to have, but not something I would anticipate everyone would, so either call in for backup once again, or snug down the lug nuts and chock the wheel to torque. Perhaps this is some elementary stuff, but I know we all start somewhere, and I still see things missed on occasion. Do things evenly, and use a star pattern. Now in this particular case, I'm using a specialty low profile socket, and I like to use the deeper portion on the tool for the wheel lock. So I'm awkwardly going to be switching sockets while I do this. Not a big deal really, and at least I know I don't have to. Once more, a final pass, and on to the next. Now for the front, as far as installing the wheels is concerned, this is where we get into some tight clearance territory, and we do need to be a little bit cautious. Especially for me personally, because I did retain the 18-inch stock wheel diameter, I feel it works perfectly best on the 350. For me, proportions are everything. Fitment doesn't just transpire between wheel, tire, and fender, but brakes too. While I'm at it and the car's already up in the air, I figured why not bust out a quick oil change. For this, I do still need to remove this stock lower cover. I would like to eventually replace this with one of those aluminum ones one day. Nothing too crazy oil-wise, but it feels good to hit the road with a fresh service. I know a lot of us like to do a 3,000 to 5,000 mile oil change interval, but truthfully, I just like to do it once a year. That annual mark works well for me, especially on the downtime of the off season. I don't normally torque my drain plugs, at least on the cars that I'm used to like this, but I have it out, so I'm gonna go ahead and use this. Just gonna set it to spec. One satisfying pour later, and to button up the underside, and we're all set. Now it's time to hit the road and give this a test. First and foremost, we are gonna bed the pads in. That way things acclimate appropriately. But most importantly, we're gonna get our first impressions of how this new brake setup feels. Right off the bat, before even moving really, I can already tell there's some new firmness in the pedal. Not only does it feel more responsive, but I honestly feel like I can tell the difference that there's that lack of flex in the firewall. Now perhaps it's all placebo, but truthfully I'm noticing a pretty significant difference here. Little things do add up. Now considering how run down my previous brake setup was, I'm noticing a significant performance bump in how this is feeling. However, the main improvements are really going to come from a lack of brake fade with that larger brake rotor. With everything working right, I decided to take the car somewhere to get some cinematics and bring things to a close. Now, even keeping it OEM plus, we do have our work cut out for ourselves to get this car perfect. But I'm gonna chip away at it. Thank you for tagging along. Until next time. Bye, guys.